David, shepherd, psalmist, king. We're looking at this man who is after God's heart. We're going to deal with that in a little bit more detail tonight. So briefly, we're coming to the 18th chapter of 1 Samuel. 18th chapter of 1 Samuel. I'd like for us to look at verses 10 through 16, and then we're going to go down for a couple of more verses past that, all right? And we'll start with Todd, please.
The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he reigned within his house, while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David invaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings. The Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. All Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in.
And we're going to go down to verses 28 through 30.
When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commander continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known.
David's name becomes well known amongst whom? The Philistines, right? The commanders and their officers and so on. It wasn't just highly or well known there, but it was even that he was highly esteemed. And that's speaking about those amongst Saul's commanders. All right? So the Philistines are becoming more aware of David's fame and the success the Lord is giving him, and all of his peers are highly esteeming him. Something to keep in mind. We're going to be seeing that as we go on. Notice what's taking place here with Saul and David. It's transitioning now from the battle with the Philistines, with Saul having great jealousy towards David. Even to the point where we see that, we'll look at verse 8. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him, the one where the women would sing the song, Saul has struck down his thousands as David his tens of thousands. You know, that this song is going to become an anthem of sorts. It's going to hit the top 10 chart. If you look ahead to chapter 21. David is going to run from Saul in chapter 22. He's going to go to the king of Gath. I say chapter 22. I'm looking down at 22. So chapter 21, he's going to run to Gath, to Achish, the king of Gath, and they're going to say to the king, isn't this David? And notice what they refer to him as. Look at verse 11. The servants of Achish said to Achish, is this not David? And what do they call him? Or verse 11. 21 verse 11. Isn't he the
top leader of Israel?
The king of
the
the
king,
land.
the king of the land? Yeah, the king of the land. Mm-hmm. So then they said, they sing to one another? So they've heard the song, and they don't have radios. They don't have the internet. They don't have television. But they've heard the song. And what's the song? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. So this is a song that's become quite famous throughout the land. We won't. There was something I was going to bring attention to, but I think I'll leave that for the time being. So do you see how great David's fame has been spreading about? It's not unlike Jesus during his day, that as he went about doing good, what ended up happening? Fame about him spread throughout the land. So here we see some of the parallels taking place. Now keep in mind that where David is a foreshadowing of Jesus, he's not a perfect foreshadowing. There's no type or shadow in the Old Testament that points to Jesus that is perfect, because there's only one who is perfect. And so there's points where we're going to say, this doesn't look like Jesus at all, because of, David is a sinner. He's an imperfect man. Whereas Jesus was not a sinner, never sinned, and he was a perfect man. He is perfect. A perfect man, fully God and fully man. So perfect in every sense of the word, in every way. Jesus, perfect. All right, so Saul doesn't like this song. This song is going all over the place. Remember, where does Saul live? He lives in a place called Gibeah. Place called Gibeah, and I don't know that I have a map of this. Just give me a moment and see. I do have a map of this. All right, so I'm going to bring this up. Have a look, and here is Gibeah. Notice Gibeah is at the top of the map. All right, Jerusalem would be right about here, except Jerusalem is not under Israelite control as of yet. So Jerusalem is approximately right about here for our online viewers. So you notice Gibeah is here, and David has gone down to Gath, which is in this region right along here, right around this area. So it's not next door, but it's not extremely far away. But keep in mind that there isn't any mode of transportation for this. There's no medium.
Donkey or something?
Well, what it would be is that people that are traveling back and forth, no matter how they're traveling, they're not getting it by radio waves. They're not picking it up by the top 10 billboard. It's by word of mouth, and people are bringing this song. See, the Philistines, for those that would be civilians that might be traveling through the area, they're hearing this word, this song that's being sung among the people. But our concern right now isn't how far and wide it is so that the Philistines are aware of it. It's just that Saul is hearing this song over and over and over and over. You know what it's like when a song comes on, Christian radio or whatever you're listening to, it seems to be there and played all the time. Well, this seemed to be the latest song that was being sung. And so Saul's very angry, and look at verse 9. And Saul eyed David from that day on. So basically from the time that they got back to Gibeah, after this great battle, Saul has his eye on David. Now, this reveals Saul's character, doesn't it? Because for the rest of the people, look at what we saw at the last verse here in verse 30, that all of the servants of Saul, or David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. So everybody loves David. Why do they love David? Because of the success that he's getting. So naturally, if there's somebody who's experiencing success, no matter what the arena they're in, then people start to get excited and they become fans, right? When somebody chooses a team, because now they're scoring more and their progress and their status and their points is going up. Well, because of the fact that David is delivering the people from their oppressors, in and of itself, that is enough for people to get excited. But for them, those that had an eye to this, they would see that David has come, the Lord has raised up this deliverer. Even though they've got a king, Saul, David is brought in, and Saul should be looking at this point saying, thank God what he has done for raising up this young man. He's come alongside to be a strength. Even what we see where Saul ends up becoming so envious of David that he ends up twice here trying to kill him by pinning him to the wall. Did you see that? In verse 11, he says, I will pin David to the wall. So he hurled his spear at him. And eventually, David's going to run for his life. We pick that up. I think it's in chapter 21 onwards, that David is now on the run. He's essentially a fugitive. So at the end of chapter 20, David, he's a man running for his life, and David pursues him. But we'll see the character of David, that he does not retaliate against Saul. Even when the Lord had orchestrated events so that Saul would come into the very cave where David and his men were seeking refuge, where Saul comes in to relieve himself. He's in a very vulnerable position, and David has the opportunity to kill him, but he does not. We're going to investigate that further, but seeing that Saul really is no greater ally than David, even when Saul becomes his enemy. David still remains his ally. He will not raise his hand against Saul. He will not allow his men to mount up in a battle or to bear arms against Saul. But Saul is completely devoured, consumed by this jealousy, which is now creating rage. Now look the term that is being used when we see in verse 14 that David had success in everything because the Lord was with him. Can you think of anyone else before David where that term is spoken a handful of times? One person in particular. And the Lord was with him. For the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. Can you think of anybody? Think back in Genesis. Good guess, but we don't have it really in that same term, although we see that the Lord went with them, but not as much with Moses himself in that specific term. So yes, the Lord was with Moses, but that term, that phrase I'm thinking of is with somebody who was sold into slavery. He was elevated. Joseph, yes. Yeah, Joseph. And we see that when he's sold into slavery, we read that the Lord was with him. When he's in Potiphar's house, we read the Lord was with him. When he's falsely accused and he's thrown into prison, and the Lord was, or for the Lord was with him. Over and over and over again, we read that for the Lord was with him. So David is experiencing great success because the Lord is with him. Now notice what comes right on the very tail of that. Saul, when he saw that David had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. This wasn't a reverential awe where he was like, wow, how does somebody get this much success? And he becomes afraid of what David might do because he's become suspicious of David that he's going to take the throne. He's actually going to say that. What else can he get besides my throne? Do you remember Saul's attitude when Samuel first said, "You're to be the new king"? Where was Saul when his coronation took place? He's hiding among all of the baggage. He's like, I think you got the wrong guy. So he wasn't eager to step into this position, but now that he has it, what's he doing? He's trying to guard it. He's trying to hang on to it with all that he has, with all that he is. But if it's God's will, then nothing anyone else can do can take it from him. But he's already been told that the Lord has rejected you as king, and he's chosen another. And then what was the characteristic of the other that he has chosen? He's chosen another who is after his own heart. And we read about that back in chapter 13. That this is a man, the one that he's chosen to take your place is after his own heart. Well, if we look down where we had made the jump to verse 28, in between that time, David marries Michal, and he becomes the son-in-law of the king. David has been promoted to being a commander of 1,000. So, although Saul's jealous, he's still assigning him responsibilities and assignments to go out and lead men in battle. He becomes the king's son-in-law by marrying his daughter. We're not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty or the details of that. I want to focus on some other aspects in our study tonight. To look at, see, in becoming, remember, when Goliath was their biggest threat, what did Saul say that I will do for the man who steps forward and kills this giant? Is successful. I'm going to make him, I'm going to give him my what? My daughter in marriage. Well, Saul didn't give that daughter in marriage to David, gave that daughter to another man because he doesn't like David. He made the promise, here's what you're going to get, but when the time comes to come good on his word, he doesn't fulfill it. And so then he sees, well, maybe this could become a snare. So rather than just giving outright his other daughter, Michal, to David, what does he say is the parameters or the qualifications for you to get her as your wife? I want you to go out and bring to me the foreskins of 100 Philistines. Because what is Saul's thinking on this? David's going to go.
He's going to get killed.
Yeah, David's going to go try to be successful in this. And he says, why should I do this when the Philistines could do this for me? So David goes out, the hand of the Lord is with him, because everything that David did, he had success because the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. So he goes out and he doesn't get the foreskins of 100 Philistines, but he gets the foreskins of 200 Philistines. Brings it back. Here we have this situation where Saul's like, I can't win for trying. There's just nothing. And he sees that the Lord is with him. So he has no other choice. He has to save face. So he gives Michal to David as his wife. Well, when Saul, look at verse 28. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So before he saw the success that he had, but he didn't really attribute that to the Lord. He just thought, this guy is one of the luckiest guys I've ever seen. Because Saul doesn't have that mindset of the Lord being with David. So he sees, how lucky can a guy be so that everything he puts his hand to, he's successful. Then he comes to the realization that the Lord's with him. and he's not with me. And so, Saul was David's enemy continually. See, do you remember what we had said about Saul? That he was the king according to whose choice? The people's choice. Which represents what? Represents the flesh. Saul represents the flesh. David represents the spirit. See, the flesh is always going to be at odds with the spirit. Where do we read about that in the New Testament? Can you think of any passage? Think of Romans chapter 8. Let's turn there just for a moment. We're going to be coming back to 1 Samuel. Let's go to Romans 8 just for a moment.
Chapter 8, what verse?
So we're going to look at Romans chapter 8, and we'll do, let's look at verse 5 to 8. 5 to 8.
Those who lived according to the sinful nature, they have minds set on what that nature desires. But those who live in the accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind of sinful man is death, but the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those controlled by the mind, by the sinful nature, cannot please God.
All right, so what does he say? The sinful mind is what toward God?
Stop.
Hostile toward God. Isn't that a picture of Saul? Saul is hostile toward God. He cannot tolerate the evidence of God leading David. Where David is a man who's after the Spirit. So that he is the man who is after God's heart. Isn't that right? So that's what we're seeing here. David is a man after God's heart, and as a result, Saul became David's enemy continually. This is a picture of the flesh and the spirit. Well, through the course of the next couple of chapters, Saul has this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of a mentality, this dual personality, this split thing that's going on. First he's nice and happy and kind towards David, and then all of a sudden he just loses his mind and he wants to kill David again. It's like he has these moments of clarity of thought, and he realizes, wait a minute, okay. But then, remember, there was a vexing spirit or a tormenting spirit that was upon Saul. And David would play on his lyre. He would worship before the Lord, and as a result, Saul would experience reprieve, some rest from this torment that was going on. And of course, Jonathan was his close ally. I mean, he was knit together with him in his soul. Remember, we spoke about that when we were together last time? He was so closely knitted together. Well, Saul ultimately decides, he turns on Jonathan. He says that, do you not realize that he's going to take the kingdom from you? So Saul is making it about more than just himself. He's trying to draw Jonathan in order to turn Jonathan against David. But Jonathan isn't the same nature, character as Saul. He wants the things of God just like David does. And he recognizes that God's hand is upon David's life, so that Jonathan, he is walking in humility. He's not trying to guard something that the Lord doesn't intend for him to have. And he realizes that the Lord has given him a position, he's given David a position, and he's quite happy to serve in the role that God has set up for him. And for him to be the supporter of David when he comes into that position. He never gets that opportunity, but Jonathan doesn't know he won't get that opportunity. But he has every desire to fulfill that, to walk in that kind of an attitude. Well, ultimately, Saul is ready to kill David. There's nothing going to change that. So at the end of chapter 20, we read that Jonathan, upon trying to convince his dad that David is his friend, not foe, that David realizes, I've got to leave. So look at verses 42. Just verse 42. That's the last verse here.
On Romans still?
So no, we're in 1 Samuel 20.
Oh,
So basically, if you go to 21 and go back one verse, that's where we're looking.
Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." Then David left. Jonathan went back.
All right, so now David, he's on the run. Jonathan goes back to town, and he does what he can to try to keep his father somewhat calm and restrained, but he won't be successful. So David, now he's on his way. He makes his way to a place called Nob. And I don't have it on the map, but I'm going to show you the location of Nob. It's very close to Gibeah. It's just a little bit north and west of it. So we've got Nob right around this area, right around here. So it's very close. I said north and west. I guess it would be a little bit west, and maybe a little bit south of that. So a little bit west and a little bit south. It's right on the outskirts of Jerusalem. It would be a little bit west, a little bit south, right around there. He's making his way to Nob as he's leaving that region. Why is he on his way to Nob? Well, that's where the tabernacle is located at this point in time. So the tabernacle is here. He goes here and he's hungry. So he's got some men that have come alongside with him, and now they've made their way. They've arrived in Nob, and when he's hungry, he comes to the priest, tells him he's hungry, do you have any food? And he says, the only thing we have is the bread of the presence, the showbread. That is meant for whom? Just the priests. Only the priests are meant to eat this. But the high priest here, Ahimelech, he realizes that, there's a greater purpose going on here. So he says, as long as you and your men have kept yourselves from women, then you are ceremonially clean enough to be able to partake in this. And so he gives them the bread. And then he said, do you have a sword here? And he said, do you remember what sword is at Nob?
Goliath.
Yes. Goliath's sword is at Nob. His armor was placed there. Remember, David brought these and the head of Goliath to Nob. And David says there's no sword like it. So he gives him Goliath's sword, and David and his men continue on their way. Well, I had mentioned that David ends up going to Gath. So let's have a look again at chapter 21 and verse 10. David figures maybe this one of the safest places for me to go is into the land of my enemies. Because if he can sort of hide there incognito, he knows that Saul can't come get him there. Well, when he makes his way, so we saw in verse 10, we've already read it, David got up, fled that day from Saul, went to Achish, the king of Gath. And that's when the servant said to Achish, why is David here? Why are you letting him be here? This is the one that they say about Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. What was this in relation to? Why were they singing this song? What battle is this connected to? Goliath, right?
Yes.
And it's against the Philistines. Where is he now? Where was Goliath from? He was from Gath. He's in Gath. Pardon me?
It might be a bad place. For
a
you
little
to
bit of a bad place for David to be. Well, when we consider this, there's. I don't want to set this up. Let's have a look at. I'm sorry, folks, on online. I've kept that up for you. See if I can get ahead here now. All right, let's bring this up. All right, so we've got 9 chapters that we are going to be looking at here. So we've got 21 through 29. And if you notice, on the screen, they're in triads. So in groups of 3. We've got 21, 22, and 23. Then we've got the next 3, 24 through 26. And then we have the next 3 of 27 through 29. And there's a literary structure that the author has put together here for us to see some contrasts that are taking place. Notice in the first and the last of the triads, it's about David primarily. And then the middle ones, at least for the first and the third, is about Saul sinning. And then the middle one is about David being spared from sinning. So we've got the first and then the third. Saul sins. First and the third, we see David is spared from sinning. And then the first and the third again, where we see that in the middle, Saul sins. See, what the Holy Spirit is doing here is that he's showing us a contrasting of character, of nature. But we see that David is not perfect, right? So he's, in chapter 25, he's about to go against Nabal. He is Abigail's husband. And to briefly mention what's taking place here, that David and his men, they've been keeping watch and they've been on the run from Saul. And because of this, they've left Gath by this point in time. They've come back to Judea and the mountains that are there. And they've settled in this region where Nabal, he's a very prosperous herdsman. And so because of David's presence and his men, they have served as guards, if you will, for Nabal's shepherds, his flocks. Well, he asks if he could have some food for his men, just as a bit of compensation, if not at the very least, as a consideration, just an act of hospitality. You know, we're here, we're hungry, we don't have much in the way of means, so would you mind giving us some food? Moreover, we've been looking after the safety of your flocks, guarding them against those that might try to come as bandits or just those that would bring damage or try to steal their flocks. But Nabal refuses to do that. And David says, all right, men, strap on your swords. We're going to go kill him and all the men in his household. What was he becoming like when he said that? Like Saul. It was the element of the flesh starting to creep in. And Abigail comes as a voice of wisdom, a voice of reason. See, Abigail is in contrast to her husband. Anybody know what the name Nabal means? Nabal means fool. So, Abigail becomes this voice of reason for Saul, or for David, to keep him from sinning. And he even says that very thing to her, that today you have kept me from sinning. So we see that there was still this, remember David, he's not perfect, right? So we see that the flesh and the spirit, there's always this enmity, this battle that's taking place. So David, though he hears the voice of reason, he hears the voice of wisdom, and he refuses to give in. So he submits once more to the Lord, and as a result, he doesn't bring any harm or evil, but the Lord shows himself to vindicate David himself, so that Nabal, he has a heart attack, and a few days later he ends up dying. So the Lord brings vengeance. It's interesting to note, look at the verses, chapters 27, 28, and 29 on our screen. I'm going to bring your attention to that once again. So chapter 27, it's the second time now. Remember back in 21, he fled to the land of the Philistines. Then he comes back. Then, chapter 27 now, so 21 he goes, now in chapter 27, after Saul's been pursuing him for like a year and a half, 2 years. Some say up to 7 years, and so it's a debate because we don't have a record to say how long it was. So a very lengthy amount of time, at the very least, that David was being pursued by Saul, and so David decides after his last encounter with Saul in chapter 26 that David and his men, they go to the Philistines. And when he goes to the Philistines, the Lord had caused the Philistines to come around to attack Saul. That brought Saul off of David's heels, and then David runs once again. So he finds refuge in the midst of the Philistines once again. And he lives there for a time in a place called Ziklag. And he kept on bringing raids against the people of the land, the inhabitants, the Canaanites, and the king thought that they were raiding against Judah. So his own people. They thought that David was fighting against his own people of Israel. And figured there's no way he can go back, so he's going to be loyal to me. Because he can't go back to his people. He can't go and join Saul. You know that Saul's been his enemy, pursuing him. He can't go back because basically he'll be considered a traitor among his people. But that wasn't the case. Well, we see that David flees to the Philistines. Chapter 28, we see that Saul sins by consulting a witch. And then in 29, David is rescued by Philistines who attack Saul. So we'll look at that in a little more detail, possibly later in this study or possibly next week. It depends upon our time. But I want us to see this. Chapter 28 is out of chronological order. Saul didn't seek the witch until after the Philistines come to attack Saul. Then he goes off, regroups, and then he's getting ready to engage the fight once more up in the Jezreel Valley. And at that point, he goes to see the witch at Endor, to see whether or not he'll have success against the Philistines. He's not asking God, going to this witch to try to talk to Samuel, who is now dead. So do you see how the Holy Spirit, even in the order of things with these triads, is showing the contrast of righteous living, living by the Spirit, versus living by the flesh? So living by the Spirit sandwiches the middle section of those who live by the flesh. Living by the Spirit versus living by the flesh. And David is the one shown to be the one who's living by the Spirit. He's a man after God's heart. Isn't that what we've seen several times? Now, I'd like for us to go to Acts chapter 13.
Acts 13,
Acts chapter 13, yes.
verse 1.
We're going to go to 16. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to read some here because I want to skip. There'll be some aspects that I'll be skipping or highlighting. So rather than interrupting, I'll read this section. And then we'll come to John for the next time. All right, so Acts chapter 13. It's easy to connect these two, Acts 13 with 1 Samuel 13, because Acts 13 is what deals with David is a man after God's own heart. And then we see that 1 Samuel 13 is where Samuel says that God has rejected you and he's chosen a man after his own heart. And we end up discovering that that man is indeed David 3 chapters later. So 1 Samuel 13 and Acts 13 are parallels. So we'll do 1 Samuel 13 here, just to show that they both speak of the man after God's heart. All right, so beginning then in verse 16, another man named Saul, whose name now he's changed it to, or he's referred to from this point on, he's referred to as Paul the Apostle. So he was birth named Saul. So just like the king. So here is this man, Paul, and he's preaching. And here's what he says. He said, all right, men of Israel, you who fear God, listen. And then he brings the people's attention to their time in Egypt, because that's a defining moment. That's the defining moment when the people of Israel became a nation. Was in Egypt, when the Lord delivered them through the Exodus. So, it says that after 40 years in the wilderness, he destroyed the 7 nations of the land of Canaan, verse 19, gave them their land as an inheritance. And all this took 430 years. After that, they had judges until Samuel, and then, verse 21, then they asked for a king. All right, so far, who's been named? Samuel's been named. That's all we've seen so far, right? Then we see that they asked for a king and God gave them, second name that is given to us, Saul, the son of Kish. Right? A man of the tribe of Benjamin, and he was king for 40 years. When he had removed him, when the Lord had removed him, he raised up David to be their king. Now I want you to notice that in the history of the people of Israel, that David is the last name that is being given until Jesus. So after David, there's a lot of people between David and Jesus. There's 1,000 years of people between David and Jesus. There's a lot of people in David's lineage that Paul could have spoken about, but he doesn't. He goes right from David directly to Jesus. Because he's showing the connection here that Jesus is the greater son of David, as it were. Because David had lots of sons. And when I say lots of sons, I mean descendants. So with that mindset, let's see what he says here. So he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. So, of this man's offspring, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised. So, what was the highlight? What was the characteristic about David? He's a man after God's heart who will do what? Everything I ask him to. So he's going to do all my will. And then the next one that he speaks of is Jesus, who David was a picture of. He speaks about John the Baptist, saying that he came preparing the way for Jesus' ministry. So he says, brothers, down in verse 26. Sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear God, to us has been sent the message of this salvation. For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not recognize him, nor understand the utterances of the prophets which are read every Sabbath, are fulfilled them by condemning him. And though they found in him no guilt worthy of death, they asked Pilate to have him executed. So Paul is bringing about this connection so that they see that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these prophecies. So when they carried out all that was written of him, not just all that they did to him, but when they did to him everything that was written, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead. So he's about to say how this is a fulfillment of Scripture. And for many days he appeared to those who had come up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. So he's talking about Peter, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, etc. His disciples. His own brothers who became believers because of the resurrection. And upwards of 500 people who had seen him at one time, alive. So he says, we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, he has now fulfilled to us who are their children. How did he fulfill it? By raising Jesus from the dead. As also it is written in the second psalm. So in other words, in Psalm number 2, you are my son, today I have begotten you. And as for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no more to return to corruption, he has spoken in this way. I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. Therefore, he says also in another psalm, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. Now, in that last psalm, it's in Psalm 16, which was written by David. He says, you will not let your Holy One see corruption. Did David see corruption? He was buried. His body corrupted, right? His body went to decay. But Jesus did not. So when David wrote this, he wasn't writing it about himself because it couldn't be applicable to him. He's writing, it's a messianic psalm. In other words, it's a psalm about the Messiah. And that's what Paul is bringing to a conclusion here. He's bringing their awareness. He says, because David, after he served the purpose of God in his own generation, he fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption. But he whom God raised up did not see corruption. We see that David is the fulfillment of the promises of God that were written by David. He's the fulfillment of the picture of David's life as he lived as a foreshadowing or a type of Christ. The one who lived according to the Spirit and not according to the flesh. And not only did so, but that he gives us power by his Spirit to overcome the flesh. So that so that the flesh would be put to death by the Spirit of God. Well, coming back to 1 Samuel for a moment. Coming to chapter 22 now. After David has been in Gath, he ends up taking off to, we're in 22. He goes to the caves of, yes, Adullam. Let's come back to our map so that we can get an idea of where David has been. All right, there's Adullam, right here. We've been down in Gath, now he comes to Adullam. Here is a cave in Adullam. So it's a fairly sizable cave. Not hard to have 300 or 400 men gathered together in a cave of this size. It's a huge cave. And there's caves all over the place in this region. So this may or may not be that cave, but it gives us an idea of what it's like. Then they went off to Keilah. So you see that indicated here once again. Then he goes to Keilah. And while he's there, David asks the Lord. He calls on the Lord through Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech the priest. And he says, Will the people of Keilah turn me over to Saul? And the Lord said yes. So David ended up leaving that place as well. See, when Saul heard that David was at the tabernacle in Nob, we read about it in chapter 22. What did Saul do? He sinned. Remember, chapter 21 was part of one of these triads. 21, David fled to the Philistines. In chapter 22, Saul sins. And how did he sin? When he came to Nob, he ended up slaughtering all of the priests. And only Ahimelech was able to escape. So, upon hearing of this, when Ahimelech comes, David is overcome. How is it that Saul could do such a thing? Simply because he felt that you were aiding and abetting me, where you're trying to hide me. But all they were doing was being kind to David, right? They weren't for or against David or for or against Saul, or against either of them. They were just for both. Well, David and his men, they had brought about some victory for Keilah, but they are going to be unloyal to David. So that if he remained there, they would have turned him over to Saul. Basically, they would have tried to do what they could to detain him or expose him so that Saul could have his way and end up killing him. Well, Saul continues to pursue David to the point that David now goes down to En-Gedi. You can see En-Gedi on the map, down by the Dead Sea. He'd been to Ziph, then he goes to En-Gedi, and here we are right here. Let's have a look at En-Gedi. After you get into En-Gedi, I guess, before he goes to En-Gedi, he ends up going to Mizpah, over in Moab. He takes his father and his mother there, his family, because they're not safe. He's concerned. So with this map is turned on its side, so the Dead Sea is going this way instead of. So here's the northern part of the Dead Sea, just so that you can see where we're at. This is the northern part right here. Okay. So this is Adullam, where David had been, and Keilah. He's gone to Mizpah, and then he goes back for a time. Then he goes to En-Gedi. So with going to En-Gedi, here he is. What do we see here at En-Gedi? Some ibexes, some goats, if you will, these deer. All right. While David is on the run, here's En-Gedi. Keep this picture in mind, okay? We have, here's a depiction in the area of En-Gedi. Here's another one. En-Gedi is an oasis in the middle of the wilderness. The Judean wilderness is harsh, it's hostile, it's dry. But come to En-Gedi, what do you find? Lots of water. Fresh, cool water. Psalm 42, it says, as the deer, what? Pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. See, David and his men have been on the run. And what are they in search of? What do they want? They want water. All right, so while David is on the run, remember, not only is he a fugitive now, we saw that he was a shepherd. We saw that he's coronated. He's anointed as king, but he's not coronated. He's anointed as king, but not yet coronated as king. Not seated as king. But he's also a psalmist. So while he's on the run, he is penning, he's writing some psalms. So let's go to Psalm 18, and this may be where we finish this evening. Psalm 18. We're going to see a few verses here. Let's do Psalm 18. We're going to say Psalm 18 and multiple verses. So let's read verses 1 to 3 to begin with. And we're at John.
Verses what?
1 to 3.
Oh, 1 to 3 and 18. Lord, how I love you, for you have done such tremendous things for me. Lord is my fort where I can enter and be safe. No one can follow me and slay me. He is a rugged mountain where I hide. He is my Savior, a rock where none can reach me, a tower of safety. He is my shield. He is like the strong horn of the mighty fighting bull. All I need to do is cry to him, oh, praise the Lord, and I am saved from all my enemies.
So David, in the midst of running from Saul, he knows that the Lord is his refuge. He knows that he is his strength. So he declares it as such. And then he speaks about the deliverances that he's experienced in terms of what the people of Israel experienced in the deliverance from Egypt. And he speaks about it in terms of, in verse 9, he bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. It's the idea of thick clouds, like when the pillar of cloud by day came and led them. Speaks of brightness before him because of that brightness of the glory of God that was displayed. The thundering of the Lord in verse 13 is like when he was on Mount Sinai. Verse 15 says that the channels of the sea were seen and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. So he's speaking about the splitting of the parting of the Red Sea. So he's speaking about the deliverance that he's been experiencing in terms of recognizing that just as God delivered his people from Egypt, so he's been delivering David. Because David has been anointed for a purpose, right? He's been prepared, selected for a purpose. And what is taking place in these in-between years is God's school of preparation. Not easy to see that. Where man, the flesh, wants to try to make that happen, wants to bring it to pass. We're going to look at that more next week when we come together, that idea. But let's look at, Todd, would you look at verse 28 down to 34.
For it is you who light my lamp. The Lord my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord, and who is a rock except our God? God who equipped me with strength and made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer, and he set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze.
So look at verse 33. He says, you made my feet like feet of the deer. These ibex that are in En-Gedi is the picture that he is thinking of. Perhaps he's writing this while he's at En-Gedi, looking at these ibex, these deer that are around him. Because these deer are able to mount and climb what appears to be unmountable paths. It's like they make their way up. And he sees that God is doing the same thing for him and those that are with him. Now, we're going to look at more Psalms when we come together next time in connection with this, to see how God has been working in David's heart and how David, as he's been pursuing after God, he's being shaped into the likeness of the one he's pursuing. So after God's heart, he's pursuing after God's heart, he's being changed into the likeness or after God's heart as well. I think we will leave that there. We'll be looking at the last couple of verses of chapter 18 when we come together next time. And we'll be looking at a passage in the New Testament and connecting them together, looking at more Psalms and how God has been delivering and leading David along the way.